All right, everyone. Hello, hello. How's everybody doing today? All right. So today we're going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking about barriers to policy implementation. Okay. And this is all in a category of policy and governance. So today we're going to be discussing uh, barriers to policy implementation and how you as a leader can use your leadership methodology. But I'm going to be, for example, using 3XP leadership and telling you how we identify, understand, and overcome those barriers. So let's start off with saying basically policies are important because they provide structure, guidance, expectations, accountability within an organization. A lot of people don't want to hear that, but that's what policies are there for, right? Creating a policy is only the beginning, though. The real challenge is implementing that policy. So you might write a policy very well, and get it approved by leadership and align it with your organizational goals. But if you don't properly implement the policy, then it's not going to produce the desired results that you expect, right? So policy implementation is simply the process of putting policy into practice, right? Implementation involves communicating the expectations, training your employees or your team members, assigning responsibilities, right, and allocating resources, monitoring progress, and evaluating results. In many organizations, you have policies fail because the idea behind them is weak to begin with. And the implementation process was unclear, inconsistent, or under-resourced or disconnected from people who expected it to be carried out. And I have, in my career, in different levels of leadership, and just in my career overall, I've seen it happen at different levels, right, from the executive level all the way down to the actual frontline supervisor or manager. But one major barrier to policy implementation is lack of clarity, right? Your team members, they may not understand what the policy means or why it was created or how it applies to their daily work. And they're not going to understand it because they're not at that level. Not many of them, most of them, or some of them are not going to understand why the policy is there. But when you have policies are written and all policies are written in complicated language, or they're not communicated, without proper explanation, then your employees are going to interpret them the way they're going to interpret them, right? Which is going to lead to confusion, inconsistent behavior, and frustration. It's the same concept as having the law, and everybody think they know the law because they interpret the law the way they see it. We know that the law is the law, and I always use this example, especially when talking to doctoral students. When you write, you want to write your work to where there is no ambiguous language, because if you ever read a law, there is no ambiguous language. It is point blank. This is the law, right? And so your policies want to be set up to kind of the same way. Hey, yeah, it's going to be written in complicated language, but it is up to you, the leader, to make sure that you are interpreting and communicating that policy properly. Right? Another barrier is a lack of leadership support. Happens all the time, right? Because I've seen it. I've been at mid-level leadership where the executives will come in and implement a policy, but because the policy is so strenuous, or it's going to be a major change to the organizational culture, they don't want to have anything to do with it. They leave us stuck, as we like to say, stuck holding the bag, right? And then as the mid-level manager, we had to figure it all out, right? Been in that situation so many times, okay? And I learned, boots on the ground. I learned, on the job training, how to handle that in different ways. And then I actually learned later on, and I didn't say I handled it the right way all the time, right? Just my experience allows me now, if that happens to me now, I know with my leadership, with 3XP leadership and in my experience, I know how to make that a smooth transition, because it's nothing but change management. And a lot of people, especially executive leaders, they run from change management, right? So like I said, another barrier is just lack of leadership support. So your policy implementation requires visible and consistent leadership. If you announce a policy but don't model it, reinforce it, or hold people accountable, your team members are not going to take it seriously. So yeah, you got to lead by example, right? As a leader, you must demonstrate that the policy matters through your words, your actions, and your decisions. You don't have to like the policy, okay? But if you're going to be a leader in your organization, then you must ensure that's the policy. It's the policy. It's not like you can use it, you don't have to use it. No, then we must implement it, right? I've been in that chair many times where I had to implement a policy. I did not like the policy, right? And it was just my professional not liking it, but I followed the policy, and I had to explain to my team members, not explain to them why I'm following the policy, but because it's the policy. But as a leader, I let them know that, hey, that they didn't see my dislike for the policy. Okay. They just understood that, the policy mattered because they saw it through my words, my actions, and all my decisions, right? Resistance to change is also a major barrier, but resistance to change is a major barrier for anything. Humans are naturally resistant to change, right? People are going to resist new policies because they are comfortable with their existing routines, and to be an executive leader, to be an exceptional executive leader, I always say you got to learn to get uncomfortable, right? Excuse me, you got to learn to get comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? But people are very comfortable with existing routines, concerned about increased workload, or they're uncertain of how the change is going to affect them. So resistance doesn't always mean that the employees are against the organization. Sometimes it just means that the employees don't understand, or your team members don't understand the purpose of the policy, or they don't trust the process behind it, right? So limited resources can also prevent successful uh, implementation of a policy. So in your organization, you may create policies without providing the time, the staffing, the technology, the training, or the funding necessary to support the policy. But a policy that requires team members to do more without giving them the tools to succeed can quickly become a resource of stress and disengagement. Higher education happens all the time. But this is the policy we're going to do now, but then there's no follow up, right? It just do it. And there's a lot of burnout, even in K-12, there's a lot of burnout. There's a lot of stress, not with Dr. Williams, right? Because that's not going to stress me out. Because like I said, I've seen this so many times before in my career. But so this is, and the reason why I've seen it is because, one of the reasons why I have my 3XP leadership and I developed 3XP leadership, because it becomes a useful framework, right, to deal with that. And one of my first elements is purpose, right? And those of you that have listened to me for a while, a minute now, know that purpose helps leaders explain why the policy matters, right? So what's the purpose? I always look at the purpose. So I can explain why the policy matters. My team members are more likely to support the implementation when they understand the reason behind the change. And as a leader, I must connect the policy to my organization's mission, values, goals, and responsibilities. Okay, so I make sure that a policy don't feel like another rule added to the workplace, right? I make it feel like it's connected to the larger organizational direction that we're going. And in early stages, and I learned this, I don't implement policies. I don't implement new policies because we are bigger or because we have more employees now. Because when we only had one or two, then we were all just buddy hanging around. Say we want no. What I did with my organization, what I did with my company was the policies that I wanted in my company, how I envisioned my company to be. I implemented those policies right off the bat, right? And then we adjust and improve and innovate as we go. But the baseline of the policy was already there. For example, if I implemented a new policy in ethics, right, then I should explain how the policy protects, the trust, strengthens the accountability, supports, TMTSI's reputation. Okay, so the purpose gives the policy meaning. Without purpose, your policy implementation can feel like compliance without commitment. And my second element in 3XP leadership is people, right? Policies are implemented by people, not paper. What does this mean to you? This means as a leader, you must consider the human side of the policy change. Your team members need communication. They need to train. They need to support. They need opportunities to ask questions, right? As a leader, you must also consider how the policy affects different groups across your organization, across your company. Okay. A people-centered approach asks, who is responsible for implementing the policy? Who will be most affected by it? What concerns might my team members have? What support do they need to meet expectations? That first question is one that I always have executive leaders look at, is who is responsible for implementing the policy. It's not going to be you that's going to be responsible for implementing the policy, more than likely as executive leader. So it's going to be more of your mid-level and your lower leaders. So what do you need to do to help them have find the purpose behind the policy and communicate that correctly, okay? When you ignore the people side of the implementation, then your policies create confusion and resistance. It just does, right? Your team members are going to feel that decisions are being made of them instead of with them, right? And then sometimes as a leader, you're going to have to make some decisions, without their input. You cannot always make a decision as a leader with your team members' input. It just doesn't happen that way. Okay, that's not real leadership, right? Unless you have a shared leadership type of model, then that's different. For instance, I'll say, for instance, I was department co-chair, and I had another chair, right? And there were certain, and she had her side that she really controlled. I didn't step into her lane, and then I had my side. But at the same time, we weren't divided. We were actually integrated. It's just, so if I saw something that actually was in her lane, I didn't make a decision, and I could have because I had that power. But we always talked about it. Say, hey, I found this out, or this is going on. What's up with this? Or I'm asking just to learn more and everything. And she did the same thing. And so, that's how we were able to share our leadership of the department, right? So the third element is process, and so in process is where implementation becomes practical, right? Your implementation has to be practical. A policy needs more than approval. It needs a clear plan, right? As a leader, you got to determine how the policy will be communicated, who will manage the implementation, what steps must be followed, what timeline will be used, and how success will be measured. Process also includes consistency. If a policy is enforced differently across departments, teams, and individuals, it does, right? It will cause damage to trust within your organization. Your team members are going to begin to believe that policies are applied based on favoritism, convenience, or personal preference. Happens, right? And the reason why it's happening, I'm not saying that that's the reason why. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm not condoning that to be in your workplace, but if you look at what's the root cause of that happening in your workplace, probably the communication from up high and from the mid level, right? Because there's no consistency. So strong processing ensures that your expectations are clear and accountable, and your accountability is fair. Excuse me. Process also requires evaluation. So as a leader, you should not assume that the implementation is successful because the policy has been introduced. No, it's just been introduced. Right? You got to monitor the outcomes, gather the feedback, identify the problems, make adjustments when needed. That means you got to get in there. You're going to have to ask those tough questions sometimes when you hear your team members talking about the policy and they might be talking negative about the policy. No, don't. As a leader, I don't go at them. I say, well, why do you think that way? Why is it that way? Well, why do you feel that way with this policy? Because I know this is what we communicate, but what's making you feel that way? It could be that person could just be an outlier. Because you just have some people that they just don't like change. They don't want to change. They want things to go their way all the time, every time. We all like that to some point, right? But when you have purpose, people, and process are aligned, your organization is more likely to achieve a stronger performance with the policy, right? And performance and policy implementation means that the policy is actually producing the intended results. And the results may improve efficiency. It can reduce your risk. It can strengthen culture. It can increase accountability. It can support compliance or improve employee or stakeholder outcomes. However, the performance must be measured, right? So as a leader, you should ask whether the policy is working, what barriers remain, and what changes are needed to improve the results, right? So that's why you ask those tough questions sometimes when you hear an employee saying something negative about, or you hear your cohort or your coworker saying something negative about a policy. Instead of most people don't. They keep quiet, and I say silence is the death of us all. But they keep quiet. They don't say anything, or they just want to agree. They fall into a group think concept, and they just agree because everybody's around, and they don't want to seem like the outlier. And not Dr. Rick. I'm going to ask. So why do you think that way, right? Or things of that nature, well, what made you feel like that? What happened that made you not like the policy? So understand a policy, again, may have a strong look in writing, but fail in practice because your organization did not prepare, its people, align its processes, or communicate the purpose. So to overcome these barriers, leaders must be intentional. You got to be intentional. And in my leadership, and that's what I love about 3XP leadership and developing that is 3XP leadership. Everything we do is intentional. It is on purpose. It's not accident. No, it's on purpose. We train on purpose, right? We decide on purpose, right? We implement on purpose. Everything we do has a purpose behind it, and we can explain that purpose. The leaders can explain the purpose. We actually take time to say, okay, if this is the policy that we're going to implement, why are we implementing this policy? And it's not because we want it to be that way. How is it going to help TMTSI become a better firm, become a better organization, and make people want to work with us? All right, and influence people. I can say many. Influence people want to work with us because we have a great culture as a company. I think we do, but we have a great culture as a company. So you got to communicate that early and often, right? As a leader, you got to provide training and resources. Don't always wait for your organization to be the one doing the training. You got a team, train your team. If you're the leader of the team and you have a team, train your team. Call a meeting one day, right? You don't have to call a meeting, call a get together. You can call it whatever the case. You don't always have to be in your office, right? Okay, we having a meeting, and the meeting's going to be at the local whatever place. Now you choose a place that's not going to be noisy and all this stuff, and your team members are not going to be distracted a lot. I can't stand that. I'm just using this for example. This actually did happen. That we had a meeting, somebody called a meeting, and they wanted to have a meeting at Hooters, and I was like, that is not an appropriate place to have a meeting, right? But they got great wings. That is not the appropriate place to have a meeting. You're not going to have people's attention, okay? And then you're going to have, and then your female employees, some of your female employees might feel offended, okay? Think, right? But no, what I mean by that, I mean it's like you can go out, you can call it your organization that has space or whatever. You can go out, get a meeting room. You don't have to be in your office or whatever, and just sit down, and hey, we're just talking, we're just hanging out, all right? And we're because we're getting to understand each other's purpose, and understanding why the policy is important, right? Because trust me, it's going to affect your team. So you also got to review the implementation data and be willing to adjust the policy if it's not working as it intended. So in closing, policy implementation is one of the most important responsibilities of leadership, right? So policies shape behavior, your accountability, and your organizational performance. Policies do not implement themselves though, okay? You as a leader must move the policy from intention to action. And through 3XP leadership, we address barriers by asking the right questions, right? Is our purpose clear? Are people prepared and supported, right? Is the process structured and consistent? Are we measuring performance and making improvements? So when we align our leaders with purpose, people, process, and performance, our policy implementation becomes more than just a compliance activity. It actually becomes a leadership strategy for creating clarity, accountability, and sustainable organizational improvement. And that is something that we always strive for here at my company. And as leaders of your organizations and leaders of your department, I hope that is something that you strive for when you're talking about a policy implementation. So until next time.